The skyline of Calgary, once a soaring testament to the unyielding power of Canadian oil, now casts a long, uncertain shadow over a nation in transition. For decades, Canada's energy sovereignty was an unspoken constant, a bedrock of the North American economy that provided a rare sense of geopolitical immunity. However, the global energy apparatus is a delicate web, and today, a single thread has been pulled with violent force. The sudden arrest of the Venezuelan president, an event miles from the frozen oil sands of Alberta, has sent a seismic ripple through the global crude market. To the average observer, the political collapse of a South American regime might seem like a distant tragedy. Yet, in the sterile offices of the Bank of Canada and the high-frequency trading floors of Toronto, the alarm bells are deafening. This is not merely a diplomatic crisis, it is an economic contagion. As global supply chains fracture, the Canadian dollar begins to fluctuate with a volatility not seen in years. We are witnessing the beginning of a profound destabilization, where the illusion of energy independence meets the harsh reality of a hyper-connected global economy. The quiet confidence of the Canadian consumer is about to be tested by a storm brewing in the Caribbean, reminding us that in the world of high-stakes economics, no nation is an island, and no resource is ever truly safe from the tides of history. The signs of instability were hidden in plain sight, buried within the complex data of international shipping manifests and credit default swap markets. Before the first headlines of the Venezuelan arrest broke, astute observers noted a sharp rise in the cost of insuring Canadian energy debt. The CDS spreads, the market's thermometer for risk, began to flicker with an unnatural heat. In the corridors of power in Ottawa, the initial reaction was one of cautious observation, yet the underlying reality was far more grim. Canada's heavy crude, particularly the Western Canadian Select, relies on a specific ecosystem of Gulf Coast refineries that are also uniquely calibrated for Venezuelan grades. When the flow of South American oil was choked by political upheaval, the resulting vacuum created a chaotic bidding war that threatened to upend the delicate balance of the North American midstream infrastructure. This was the early warning, a subtle decoupling of domestic production from price stability. It wasn't just about the price of a barrel. It was about the sudden erosion of the logistical certainty that had anchored the Canadian energy sector for decades. As liquidity began to tighten in the energy futures market, the first cracks appeared in the confidence of major institutional investors. The shadow of 1990, when Canada's debt-to-GDP ratio once spiraled toward a crisis, began to loom once again in the collective memory of the nation's financial architects. As the shockwaves intensified, the mechanism of the crisis transitioned from speculative fear to tangible economic friction. The Canadian dollar, often classified as a commodity currency, began to exhibit a paradoxical behavior. While rising oil prices usually bolster the loonie, the sheer scale of global instability triggered a massive flight to safety, driving investors toward the US dollar and causing the CAD to weaken against its southern neighbor. This devaluation instantly increased the cost of imported machinery and technology vital for Alberta's oil sands operations, creating a localized inflationary pressure that squeezed the margins of domestic producers. Liquidity in the Canadian corporate bond market began to evaporate as lenders looked at the chaos in the Venezuelan energy sector and wondered if Canadian sovereignty was as insulated as they had assumed. This is the hallmark of an economic ripple. It begins as a specific supply disruption and evolves into a broad-based liquidity crunch. The Bank of Canada, monitoring the overnight rate with increasing anxiety, found itself caught between the need to curb rising energy-driven inflation and the necessity of keeping credit flowing to a nervous industrial base. The cost of borrowing for major energy projects spiked almost overnight, stalling multi-billion-dollar capital investments and casting a pall over the nation's long-term fiscal projections. To understand the magnitude of the Venezuelan ripple, one must look at the historical wreckage of nations that failed to navigate similar energy-driven shocks. The ghost of Argentina's 2001 default and the hyperinflationary collapse of the very nation at the center of this storm, Venezuela, serve as grim reminders of how quickly a sovereign economy can unravel. In those cases, the common denominator was a lethal combination of over-reliance on a single commodity and a sudden loss of access to international credit markets. Canada, though far more structurally sound, is not immune to these forces. During the early 1990s, Canada faced its own debt wall, where skyrocketing deficits and interest rates led the Wall Street Journal to label the country an honorary member of the Third World. The current crisis threatens a return to that precarious state. When global energy prices fluctuate due to political instability, the real estate market in Vancouver and Toronto, already bloated by cheap credit, becomes a secondary casualty. As the central bank is forced to maintain high interest rates to protect the currency's value, the cost of servicing both national and household debt reaches a breaking point. The Greek and Turkish experiences of the last decade further illustrate that when a primary economic pillar is shaken, the subsequent loss of investor confidence can trigger a spiral that even the most advanced economies struggle to contain. The impact of the Venezuelan Ripple quickly transcended the high-rise offices of Bay Street, manifesting in the daily lives of Canadian families from coast to coast. As energy sovereignty flickered, the most immediate consequence was felt at the gas pump and on the monthly utility bill. In a country defined by its vast distances and harsh winters, the cost of energy is not a luxury. It is a survival requirement. However, the secondary effects were even more insidious. As the price of diesel climbed due to global supply uncertainty, the cost of transporting food and consumer goods followed suit. This cost-push inflation began to erode the purchasing power of the average household, forcing a sudden and painful shift in consumption patterns. The Canadian real estate market, a significant driver of national wealth, faced a direct threat as mortgage rates climbed in tandem with rising bond yields. For the young family in a Calgary suburb or the retiree in Ontario, the Venezuelan crisis was no longer a headline about a distant arrest. It was a tangible reduction in their standard of living. The psychological impact of seeing a G7 nation's energy security compromised led to a sharp decline in consumer confidence. People began to hoard cash, liquidity in the retail sector dried up, and the once robust Canadian dream started to feel increasingly fragile under the weight of global geopolitical volatility. The halls of Parliament Hill and the fortified offices of the Bank of Canada became the war rooms of a nation under financial siege. As the Venezuelan Ripple threatened to turn into a tidal wave, the policy response had to be both swift and surgical. The central bank faced a brutal policy trilemma: how to stabilize a fluctuating currency, curb energy-driven inflation, and prevent a total collapse of the credit-sensitive housing market. Initially, the Bank of Canada signaled a hawkish stance, raising the overnight rate to defend the loonie against a surging US dollar, aiming to prevent the importing of inflation. However, this tightening sent shockwaves through a populace burdened by record-high household debt. Simultaneously, the federal government was forced to pivot toward immediate energy security, weighing the release of strategic reserves and targeted fuel subsidies to prevent a logistical standstill. These interventions, while necessary, raised the specter of a ballooning national deficit. The ghost of the 1993 budget, a time when Canada slashed spending to avoid a fiscal cliff, re-emerged. The government's challenge was to project absolute stability to international bondholders, knowing that any perception of weakness could trigger a catastrophic flight of capital similar to the crises seen in emerging markets. As the government grappled with macro stability, the focus shifted to the individual. For the Canadian citizen, the crisis necessitated a rapid adoption of survival strategies. The era of easy credit was over, replaced by a scarcity mindset that hadn't been seen since the mid-90s. Financial advisors began urging a pivot toward high liquidity. Cash and short-term government bonds became the refuge for those fleeing the volatile equity and real estate markets. Households started practicing defensive consumption, cutting non-essential spending and prioritizing debt repayment as floating-rate mortgages threatened to reset at levels not seen in a generation. On the professional front, the instability underscored the importance of skill diversification. Workers in the energy sector, once the highest earners in the country, sought ways to leverage their expertise in renewable energy or tech-driven efficiency, realizing that being tethered to a single globally intertwined commodity was a risk they could no longer afford. Community-level cooperation also saw a resurgence. Local exchange networks and credit unions became vital for small businesses that were being squeezed out by the tightening lending standards of the Big Five banks. These individual actions, while born of necessity, formed a collective grassroots effort to buffer the economy against the Venezuelan Ripple, proving that a nation's resilience is ultimately measured by the adaptability of its people. The fragility of energy sovereignty is perhaps best understood through the lens of infrastructure. As the Venezuelan Ripple disrupted global heavy oil flows, the limitations of Canada's own pipeline and refining capacity were laid bare. For years, the debate over pipeline expansion had been framed as an environmental or political issue, but the arrest of a foreign leader turned it into an immediate economic security crisis. Without the ability to efficiently move product to diverse international markets, Canada remained a captive supplier to a singular, volatile refining hub. This lack of strategic flexibility acted as a force multiplier for the initial shock. As Canadian producers were forced to sell their crude at even steeper discounts to keep storage from reaching capacity, the Canadian price became a symbol of a missed opportunity. This structural bottleneck didn't just hurt the bottom line of oil giants. It drained the provincial royalties that fund hospitals and schools in Edmonton and Regina. The ripple effect here was clear. A failure to build domestic resilience in times of peace creates a profound vulnerability in times of global conflict. The lesson was harsh. Sovereignty isn't just about having resources under the ground. It's about having the sovereign power to move them to the world on your own terms, regardless of the chaos brewing in distant capitals. The erosion of energy sovereignty quickly translated into a broader crisis of confidence in the Canadian financial system. As the Venezuelan Ripple continued to distort energy pricing, the Canadian dollar's status as a stable petrocurrency was scrutinized by international currency traders. This scrutiny led to a sharp increase in the country's sovereign risk premium. In the global bond markets, Canada found itself competing for capital with other resource-rich nations, but with the added burden of a highly leveraged domestic population. The spread between Canadian 10-year government bonds and U.S. Treasuries began to widen, an indicator that the world was demanding a higher uncertainty tax for lending to Ottawa. This was not a theoretical problem for economists. It meant that the interest rates on everything from government infrastructure projects to personal lines of credit began to rise independently of the Bank of Canada's target rate. The liquidity that once flowed freely through the veins of the Canadian economy was now being diverted to safer, more predictable jurisdictions. This capital flight mirrored the early stages of the Turkish lira's struggles, where external political shocks combined with internal vulnerabilities to create a feedback loop of devaluation and rising costs. The nation was learning a painful lesson. When you lose control over your energy narrative, you risk losing control over your financial destiny. The stress on the national balance sheet began to force a difficult conversation about Canada's fiscal future. For years, the country had balanced its books on the premise of a stable, high-value energy export sector. But with the Venezuelan Ripple effectively devaluing Canada's strategic leverage, the federal deficit began to swell at an alarming rate. Tax revenues from the energy sector plummeted, while the cost of servicing existing national debt rose due to the aforementioned risk premiums. This scenario echoed the lost decade of Latin American economies in the 1980s, where sudden shifts in commodity prices left governments unable to fulfill their social contracts. In Canada, the immediate pressure was felt in the funding of the Canada Health Transfer and other provincial equalization payments. The federal government found itself in a precarious position. It needed to spend to stimulate the economy, yet every dollar of new debt was becoming increasingly expensive. The specter of a credit rating downgrade, something Canada had avoided during the 2008 financial crisis, was now a frequent topic in cabinet meetings. This was the true cost of the destabilization. It wasn't just a temporary market dip, but a structural threat to the social and economic safety nets that define the Canadian identity. The nation was forced to confront the reality that its fiscal sovereignty was inextricably linked to its energy sovereignty, and both were now under siege. As the national fiscal structure began to buckle, the contagion spread to the Canadian banking sector, the traditionally conservative fortress of the nation's wealth. The Big Five banks, heavily exposed to both the residential mortgage market and the energy sector's revolving credit facilities, started to tighten their lending criteria with surgical precision. This phenomenon, often called a credit crunch, meant that even credit-worthy small businesses found themselves unable to secure the working capital needed to navigate the rising costs of operation. The Venezuelan Ripple had effectively created a liquidity trap within the Canadian borders. While the Bank of Canada attempted to inject liquidity into the repo market, the commercial banks remained hesitant to pass that ease along to the public, fearing a wave of defaults in the oil patch. This risk aversion was reminiscent of the 2008 global financial crisis, though the trigger this time was uniquely Canadian in its reliance on energy stability. The interbank lending rate, the rate at which banks lend to one another, began to see stress spikes, signaling a lack of trust in the collateral underlying the Canadian financial system. For the average investor, this meant that high-interest savings accounts and GICs were no longer just passive income tools, but vital hedges against a banking system that was increasingly prioritizing capital preservation over economic growth. In the face of this systemic contraction, the Canadian real estate market, long considered the unsinkable engine of domestic wealth, entered a period of profound reevaluation. The Venezuelan Ripple acted as a catalyst that finally exposed the extreme sensitivity of Canadian property values to global bond market fluctuations. As yields on the Government of Canada 5-year bonds climbed, mortgage providers were forced to raise their fixed rates, ending the era of historical affordability. In cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where the price-to-income ratios were already at breaking points, the sudden spike in borrowing costs led to a sharp drop in transaction volumes. This wasn't just a cooling of the market, it was a liquidity freeze. Sellers, anchored to the peak prices of the previous year, refused to budge, while buyers found themselves disqualified by the rigorous stress tests mandated by federal regulators. This stalemate mirrored the property crashes seen in Ireland and Spain during the Eurozone crisis, where a reliance on external capital and low interest rates created a bubble that burst when global conditions shifted. For many Canadian families, their primary asset, their home, suddenly transitioned from a source of financial security to a looming liability. The wealth effect reversed. As home equity began to evaporate, consumer spending plummeted further, deepening the recessionary cycle and proving that energy sovereignty and housing stability are two sides of the same economic coin. As the domestic market tightened, the focus shifted to the international stage, where Canada's reputation as a safe haven was being tested against the reality of its resource dependency. The global investment community began to draw uncomfortable parallels between Canada and other nations that had failed to diversify their economic engines. Comparisons to the Norwegian model became frequent and unflattering. Unlike Norway, which had funneled its North Sea oil wealth into a massive sovereign wealth fund to buffer against price shocks, Canada had largely utilized its energy revenues to fund current expenditures and maintain low tax regimes. The Venezuelan Ripple exposed the lack of a national rainy day fund on a federal scale. International credit rating agencies, such as Moody's and S&P, placed Canada's AAA rating on negative outlook, citing the twin risks of energy price volatility and high household debt. This was a psychological blow to the nation's pride. In the global pecking order of economies, Canada was drifting away from the core stability of the G7 and closer to the fragile status often associated with emerging markets during a commodity bust. The loss of this gold standard status meant that future borrowing would be even more expensive, creating a permanent drag on the national economy. The message from the global markets was clear. Transparency and past performance were no longer enough. Without a structural shift toward energy independence and fiscal discipline, the Canadian premium was a thing of the past. The crisis eventually forced a radical rethinking of Canada's internal trade and resource management. As the Venezuelan Ripple disrupted international supply lines, the lack of an integrated east-west energy corridor became a glaring strategic failure. For years, the Atlantic provinces and Quebec had relied on imported crude, often from volatile regions, while Western Canada struggled to find a path for its surplus. This internal fragmentation meant that while Alberta was drowning in unmarketable oil, Eastern refineries were paying a conflict premium for foreign supplies. This irony was not lost on the Canadian public. The economic shock acted as a catalyst for a new national energy realignment, pushing provincial leaders to set aside long-standing jurisdictional disputes in favor of collective survival. However, building such infrastructure in the midst of a credit crunch and high inflation was an almost insurmountable task. The situation mirrored the early 20th century push for a national railway, where the survival of the Canadian project itself was at stake. The government's attempt to fast-track energy pipelines was met with the same resistance as before. But this time, the stakes were personal for every citizen facing rising heating bills. The lesson was becoming increasingly clear. True sovereignty requires not just the extraction of wealth, but the internal unity to distribute it effectively across the nation, regardless of the chaos beyond its borders. The persistent volatility triggered by the Venezuelan Ripple eventually forced the Bank of Canada into an unconventional monetary experiment. With traditional interest rate hikes reaching their limit of effectiveness against supply-side inflation, the central bank turned to a targeted form of sectoral liquidity injection. This move was designed to prevent a total insolvency crisis in the energy heartland without further overheating the housing markets of the East. However, this nuanced approach created a dual-track economy, where the cost of borrowing varied significantly depending on the industry and region. Critics compared this to the tiered interest rate systems seen in struggling European economies during the height of the sovereign debt crisis. As the Canadian dollar continued its erratic dance, the central bank's gold and foreign exchange reserves were called upon to defend the currency's floor, a move not seen in decades. This intervention was a stark admission that Canada's economic moat had been breached. The liquidity that once underpinned the nation's social stability was now being diverted to plug holes in a sinking fiscal ship. For the average citizen, this meant that the reliability of the national currency was no longer a guarantee, but a variable subject to the whims of global geopolitical actors. The psychological transition from a stable G7 power to a reactive, vulnerable state was complete, leaving the nation to wonder if its days of economic exceptionalism were over. As the economic pressure became a permanent fixture of the Canadian landscape, a profound social transformation began to take root. The middle-class dream, once defined by home ownership and a predictable path to retirement, started to fracture under the weight of the Venezuelan Ripple. We began to see the emergence of a K-shaped recovery, where those with diversified global assets flourished, while those tethered to the domestic economy and traditional employment saw their wealth evaporate. This widening inequality was not merely a matter of income, but of resilience. The impact on the younger generation was particularly severe. As the cost of basic necessities soared and the barriers to entry for the housing market became insurmountable. A sense of economic nihilism began to permeate the national psyche. This social erosion is a classic symptom of long-term economic destabilization, seen in the historical declines of once prosperous nations like Argentina. When a population loses faith in the fairness of the economic system, the resulting social friction becomes a secondary crisis in itself. Labor strikes, once rare, became frequent as workers fought for inflation-adjusted wages that the struggling private sector could ill afford. The nation was learning that energy sovereignty is not just about fuel for engines, but the fuel for social cohesion. Without it, the very fabric of the Canadian mosaic began to pull at the seams. As the crisis deepened, the narrative of Canadian exceptionalism was replaced by a pragmatic, almost desperate search for structural reform. The Venezuelan Ripple had exposed a critical flaw in the nation's economic DNA: the lack of a diverse export base that could survive a prolonged energy shock. For the first time in generations, there was a serious, nonpartisan push to transition Canada from a resource pull economy to an innovation push economy. However, the tragedy lay in the timing. Transitioning an entire national economy requires massive capital investment, the very thing that had become prohibitively expensive due to the soaring risk premiums and high interest rates. The government found itself in a development trap, similar to those described by economists studying the structural adjustments of the 1990s in Southeast Asia. To attract foreign investment back to its shores, Canada had to offer increasingly aggressive tax incentives, which in turn starved the public treasury of the funds needed to build the very infrastructure required for a green or tech-driven transition. This paradox meant that the nation was running faster just to stay in the same place. The lingering influence of the Venezuelan arrest served as a constant reminder that in a globalized world, a nation's sovereignty is only as strong as its ability to adapt to changes it cannot control. The Canadian spirit was being forged in a fire of necessity, moving away from the complacency of the resource boom toward a leaner, more resilient, but undeniably more difficult future. The long-term consequence of the Venezuelan Ripple was a fundamental shift in how Canada approached its relationship with its largest trading partner, the United States. For years, the integration of the North American energy market was seen as a symbiotic strength, but the crisis revealed it to be a double-edged sword. As the U.S. moved toward greater self-sufficiency through its own shale revolution, Canada found itself increasingly marginalized within its own neighborhood. The arrest of the Venezuelan president and the subsequent market chaos forced Canadian policymakers to realize that energy sovereignty could no longer mean energy dependence on the U.S. market. This led to a difficult and costly pivot toward Asian and European markets, requiring massive investment in coastal LNG terminals and transcontinental infrastructure. This strategic realignment was not just about finding new buyers. It was about regaining the leverage to set prices rather than being a price taker in a volatile global market. This shift mirrored the economic pivots of nations like Australia, which had successfully diversified its trade to become a primary supplier to the growing economies of the Indo-Pacific. However, for Canada, this transition was fraught with political tension, as it required balancing the immediate needs of the domestic industry with the long-term demands of global environmental standards. The era of the safe, quiet neighbor was over. Canada was being forced to play a high-stakes game of global energy chess, where every move was a gamble for its economic survival. The Venezuelan Ripple served as a catalyst for a profound reassessment of the Canadian, quote, social contract. In the decades prior, the nation's wealth, fueled by stable energy exports, had supported a generous welfare state and a robust public sector. However, as the energy-linked revenue streams became increasingly volatile and the cost of debt servicing climbed, the limits of this model were laid bare. We began to see the Dutch disease in reverse. A scenario where the decline of a dominant resource sector doesn't just hurt the industry itself, but drags down the entire fiscal framework of the country. This transition was marked by a series of painful austerity measures at both the provincial and federal levels. To maintain international credit credibility, Canada had to make choices that were previously unthinkable. Restructuring pension plans, scaling back infrastructure projects, and increasing the tax burden on a middle class already struggling with the highest cost of living in a generation. This fiscal tightening was reminiscent of the structural adjustments seen in the United Kingdom during the late 20th century, where the transition away from traditional industrial bases led to years of social unrest and economic recalibration. The ripple had evolved from a market shock into a fundamental challenge to the Canadian way of life, forcing a nation to define what it truly valued when the easy wealth of the soil was no longer a guarantee of prosperity. As the documentary reaches its final chapters, we must examine the ultimate question. What does it mean to survive in an era of global volatility? The Venezuelan Ripple was more than a market fluctuation. It was a masterclass in the fragility of modern economic systems. For Canada, the lesson was expensive but necessary. The nation learned that true energy sovereignty is not found in the quantity of one's reserves, but in the diversity of one's economic pillars and the resilience of one's financial infrastructure. Looking back at the crisis, we see that the individuals who thrived were not those who waited for a return to the old normal, but those who embraced the new reality of high-frequency change. They diversified their assets, reduced their reliance on cheap credit, and invested in the most valuable commodity of all, adaptability. The government, too, began a slow but deliberate pivot toward a more fortress-like fiscal policy, prioritizing debt reduction and strategic autonomy over short-term growth. This shift, while painful, laid the groundwork for a more stable, albeit more modest, Canadian economy. The Venezuelan arrest will be remembered as the moment the resource curse was finally confronted, forcing a G7 nation to grow up and recognize that in the global theater, the only true security is the security you build for yourself, shielded from the unpredictable ripples of a distant, chaotic world. In the aftermath of the crisis, the concept of sovereign liquidity took on a new, urgent meaning for the Canadian household. The Venezuelan Ripple had proved that even the most stable-looking currencies could be humbled by global events, leading to a permanent shift in how Canadians managed their private wealth. We witnessed a move toward real asset diversification, a strategic shift into tangible commodities, gold, and international equities that were not tied to the Canadian energy cycle. This was not mere speculation. It was a survival strategy born from the realization that the national economy was too heavily concentrated in a single, vulnerable sector. Financial literacy programs across the country began to emphasize the importance of the inflation hedge, teaching a new generation that holding all one's wealth in a single currency or a single housing market was a risk that could no longer be ignored. This grassroots economic evolution mirrored the behavior of citizens in nations like Switzerland or Singapore, who have long understood that small, open economies must remain hyper-vigilant. As the dust settled, the Canadian consumer emerged more cautious, more globalized in their thinking, and far less dependent on the state's ability to guarantee price stability. The ripple had passed, but the mindset of the nation had been permanently altered, trading the comfort of the past for a harder, more disciplined form of financial independence. As we look toward the horizon, the legacy of the Venezuelan Ripple remains etched into the very foundation of the Canadian energy landscape. The crisis was a brutal reminder that energy sovereignty is a living, breathing responsibility, not a static achievement. Today, the derricks of Alberta and the offshore rigs of Newfoundland operate with a new sense of purpose, integrated into a national strategy that prioritizes domestic resilience over short-term export gains. The government's role has shifted from a passive beneficiary of royalties to an active architect of energy security, investing in the diversification of the grid and the hardening of national infrastructure against future shocks. This isn't just about oil and gas. It's about the total energy ecosystem, from the lithium mines of the north to the hydrogen hubs of the east. The Venezuelan Ripple taught us that when the world is in chaos, a nation's true strength lies in its ability to stand on its own 2 feet. We close this chapter of Canadian history not with a sense of defeat, but with a renewed commitment to a sovereign future. The arrest of a president thousands of miles away may have destabilized our present, but it forced us to build a more secure, more united, and more prosperous tomorrow. The Ripple has finally reached the shore, and Canada, though changed, stands stronger for having weathered the storm. The echoes of the Venezuelan Ripple ultimately reached far beyond the borders of North America, serving as a cautionary tale for the entire G7. For decades, advanced economies operated under the assumption that their sophisticated financial systems and diverse service sectors provided a permanent shield against commodity volatility. Canada's struggle shattered this illusion, revealing that even a high-income nation can be brought to its knees when its energy sovereignty is compromised. International observers began to study the Canadian contagion as a new model of economic vulnerability in a post-globalization world. It became clear that the arrest of a leader, or the collapse of a regime in a distant corner of the globe, is no longer an isolated geopolitical event. It is a systemic risk that can be transmitted instantly through the veins of global trade and finance. This realization has sparked a global movement toward strategic autonomy, where nations are increasingly prioritizing the security of their supply chains over the efficiency of global markets. Canada, having stood at the epicenter of this shift, now serves as a blueprint for others. The nation's journey from a reactive participant in the global market to a proactive architect of its own destiny provides a vital lesson. In an age of unprecedented connectivity, the only way to protect your sovereignty is to ensure that your economic foundation is built on more than just the shifting sands of global oil prices. The story of the Venezuelan Ripple is not merely a chronicle of a crisis, but a profound meditation on the nature of national wealth in an era of volatility. We have seen how the arrest of a political figure can dismantle the perceived certainties of a G7 economy, reminding us that in the 21st century, isolation is impossible. The Canadian experience serves as a stark reminder that economic prosperity is a fragile construct, requiring constant vigilance and a willingness to evolve. As lights flicker on in homes across Canada tonight, the energy powering them flows from a more diverse, resilient, and sovereign network than ever before. This journey has transformed the national psyche from resource-driven complacency to calculated strategic depth. We are no longer just a nation of hewers of wood, but a nation of strategic architects who understand the interconnectedness of geopolitics and finance. The Calgary skyline, which once symbolized the raw power of a single commodity, now represents the complexity of a multifaceted economy built to withstand global shocks. The final lesson of the Ripple is that stability is not a fixed destination, but a continuous process of adaptation. It is the quiet strength to look at the storm on the horizon and know that the foundation is finally deep enough to hold against the tides of history. As we look back at the years following the Venezuelan Ripple, it becomes clear that the event was a transformative threshold. The new Canada that emerged is one defined by a newfound economic sobriety. No longer content with windfall profits from a single commodity boom, the nation has integrated rigorous stress testing into its federal fiscal planning. This change reflects a fundamental shift in identity. The Canadian ethos has evolved from quiet abundance to active, strategic preservation. Schools of economics now use this crisis as the primary case study for resource resilience, teaching that true wealth is the ability to navigate uncertainty without sacrificing social stability. This intellectual pivot ensures that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. We have moved from a nation that reacted to global events to one that anticipates them, building a buffer of innovation and fiscal discipline. The Venezuelan Ripple was a harsh teacher, but it left us with a more durable and self-reliant country. The shadow over Calgary has been replaced by a vision of a future where Canada's prosperity is written by its own hand, independent of a world in flux. The ultimate legacy of the Venezuelan Ripple is found not in the balance sheets of corporations or the vaults of the central bank, but in the quiet resilience of the Canadian people. We have moved beyond the naive assumption that our geography and our resources provide a permanent sanctuary from the chaos of the world. Instead, we have embraced a more mature, more realistic understanding of our place in the global order. This crisis was the fire that forged a new national character, one that values stability over speculation and preparedness over complacency. As we conclude this investigation into the destabilization of our energy sovereignty, we are left with a final, lingering truth. A nation's true wealth is its people's ability to remain calm when the world is in turmoil. The Venezuelan Ripple was a warning, a challenge, and ultimately, a gift. It forced us to look into the mirror and decide what kind of nation we wanted to be. Today, as Canada stands as a beacon of resource security and fiscal discipline in an increasingly unpredictable world, we can say that we chose wisely. The storm has passed, the ripples have faded, and what remains is a country that is no longer just a participant in the global economy, but a master of its own destiny, standing firm against whatever tide history decides to send next. The journey through the Venezuelan Ripple has redefined the concept of individual agency in a globalized economy. For the discerning viewer, the ultimate takeaway is the necessity of radical self-reliance. Economic sovereignty begins at the household level, through the meticulous management of liquidity and the rejection of the debt-fueled consumption models of the past. As we have seen, the volatility of a single commodity can unravel the fiscal stability of a G7 nation. Therefore, the individual must operate like a sovereign entity, diversifying across asset classes and geographies. This is not just financial advice, it is a philosophy of resilience. We must transition from being passive participants in a resource-heavy economy to becoming active managers of our own risks. The era of the guaranteed middle-class path is over, replaced by a landscape that rewards those who are hyper-vigilant and intellectually agile. By understanding the invisible threads that connect a foreign political crisis to the mortgage rates in Toronto, we empower ourselves to act before the next ripple reaches our doorstep. The final survival strategy is simple: stay informed, stay liquid, and never mistake a period of calm for permanent peace. As the final credits roll on this investigation into the Venezuelan Ripple, the skyline of Calgary stands not as a monument to past vulnerability, but as a beacon of future defiance. This story has been a journey through the mechanics of economic contagion, from the first spark of political unrest in South America to the fundamental reshaping of the Canadian social contract. We have learned that energy sovereignty is not a gift of geography, but a hard-won prize of strategic foresight and national unity. The arrest of a president was merely the catalyst that exposed the cracks in an outdated model, forcing a great nation to reinvent itself under pressure. As we move forward into an increasingly fragmented global landscape, the lessons of this crisis remain our most valuable currency. Stability is never a destination. It is a discipline. Let this be the final word on the Venezuelan Ripple, that Canada, through trial and upheaval, found the courage to reclaim its own narrative. We are no longer a nation defined by what the world demands from us, but by the strength we have built within. The ripples of history will continue to move across the global stage, but Canada now stands as a rock, immovable and sovereign, ready for the tides to come.